Good morning, everyone. Welcome to CIVIS Days. My name is Kevin Noone. I am a professor in the Department of Environmental Science here at Stockholm University. And today I'd like to begin a conversation about higher education in the Anthropocene, talking about some challenges and opportunities for that. So where would we want to go today? Again, this is the start of a conversation, and I'd like to start that by talking first about some definitions, wicked problems, the Anthropocene, and connections between those two in higher education. Talk about some tensions and balances if we want to try to adapt higher education for the Anthropocene. There will be inevitable tensions and balances we need to reconcile. Talk about incentivizing CIVIS and transdisciplinarity in our educational and our research systems. And finally, leave you with some questions and potential ways forward that I hope we'll have a much deeper and longer conversation about. So, what are some of the definitions? Let's start with wicked problems. What are they? Wicked problems are very conceptually complex. They're not easy, but there are a number of other aspects of wicked problems that are important. They're dynamic. They change quickly with time. They're tightly coupled to and interact with other problems, so you can't approach wicked problems in isolation from other issues. They're often characterized by conflicting, incomplete information. We don't know all the aspects of a wicked problem. They often contain normative characteristics, so opinions or value structures come into play when we talk about wicked problems. And finally, different stakeholders have not only different conceptions of each wicked problem, but they also have different ideas about what solutions might be to wicked problems. What about the Anthropocene? Now, you can tend to spend a long time defining and talking about the Anthropocene, but this particular plot for me is a good one to explain what the Anthropocene is. On the x-axis, we have time before present. So that's going to about 25,000 years in the past, and it goes after zero to about 100 years, or towards the end of the century, 2100. The vertical axis is global temperature. And this is actually a combination of data and projections. The data come from the two references at the bottom, fantastic work. The projections come from a climate model looking into the future. So what do we see? When the Ice Age was coldest, the last glacial maximum about 23,000 years ago, the global temperature was about 3.5 degrees Celsius cooler than it is now. That temperature rose at the end of the Ice Age, and here in this particular period, the last roughly 10,000 years, that's when we humans started doing things like building settlements, building towns, building civilizations. So our entire history with building civilizations, we learned in this relatively short, relatively stable period. What's happening into the future? If we continue with business as usual, the global temperature might increase by as much as 3 to even 4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. That's a different world. That's far different from the world that we learned how to make civilizations. So that's what the Anthropocene is about. Huge planetary changes on a very rapid timescale. We need to be able to adapt and deal with those. So how do we connect higher education and the Anthropocene? I love this image from the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report. This is the latest one from 2020. And what you see here is different kinds of risks. Blue are economic, green are environmental. We have societal, geopolitical, technological risks. But what you see in the image is that all of these risks are connected to each other, often very tightly connected to each other. The one with the largest diamond, the largest perceived risk, is climate action failure. That's the green one in the middle. But that's connected to a whole bunch of other risks of very different kinds. So for wicked problems in the Anthropocene, we need to be able to train people to deal with this kind of risk picture, come up with strategies for doing that. There's a lovely quote from an earlier version of the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report 2018 that points out that while we've become quite adept at dealing with conventional risks, In their words, we are much less competent when it comes to dealing with complex risks in the interconnected systems that underpin our world, such as organizations, economies, societies, and the environment. That's where we need higher education to come in and help us alleviate that particular problem. Of course, there are always tensions and balances when you try to adapt to new situations that we have to deal with. What are some of those? So this is an image that I created from the Stockholm University website just this week, and you can't read it. And that's kind of what will help me make the point that I want to make with this image. Here we're organized into different faculties. Each one of those faculties has a number of different departments. Each one of those departments might have a number of different units to it. And they all have a disciplinary focus. So from this point of view, we're organized well to go into depth, to drill deeply into a particular subject. If you take the sum of all of those different departments and different disciplines, that's a good measure of breadth as well. But what we're really after is a product of that. We'd like volume, not just area, but volume as well. And so, frankly, I don't know even where to find a number of these departments. And I've been here at Stockholm University for about 30 years. So we're not good enough at interaction among the depth and the siloed approach that we take in our organization. There are some ways around that. And the picture on the left here comes from the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization in Australia, CIRO. And this is kind of an old picture. I don't even know if they still use this structure anymore. But it's a matrix management approach. So the colored vertical profiles, those are the silos, the departments, the disciplines, if you will, represented within CIRO at the time. This is about a decade old or so. The horizontal structures, what you can see, are what they called flagship operations. And they needed input, they needed people, they needed resources from each one of the disciplines, each one of the departments, in order to make them happen. So that's one way of trying to multiply depth by breadth and get to something a little bit larger. Can we apply that or not? That's part of the conversation that I'd like us to have. So, what are some of the challenges for us in higher education in adapting to wicked problems in the Anthropocene? One of those challenges is how do we augment our very disciplinary, siloed structure to engender and support inter- and transdisciplinary studies? So not only collaborating with other academics, but collaborating with stakeholders outside of academia in what we do. How do we find ways to reward participation in those sorts of activities, that transdisciplinary activity? How do we enable breadth, a combination of breadth of knowledge and depth? There's an extraordinary value of being able to drill deeply into a subject that we're good at doing at this point. But how do we augment that without losing that very valuable depth that we have been able to achieve? And finally, in an environment of post-truth and alternative facts, how do we illuminate the value of evidence, expertise, and scholarship in an environment where those don't appear to be valued as much as perhaps they once were? What are some of the opportunities for this? Those are challenges, but there are opportunities. One of the greatest ones is perhaps a solidified support for research and higher education through increased visibility, but probably more importantly, through an increased perception of relevance. If we're actually doing education and research with society, that will be perceived to be more relevant than us doing it either separate from or for society. So the prepositions here are actually quite important. We have the opportunity to train practitioners to act in the Anthropocene and help reconnect knowledge to meaning. There's a lovely literature about the separation of knowledge, what we know about how things work, and what that means, how that can actually enable us to act and move forward and engage in strategic planning. And finally, the opportunity is for us, for higher education, to be an active actor in moving societies towards a finer future. So, where do we go from here? How do we make that happen? Well, some of that has to do with how we incentivize doing these sorts of things. So I wanted to show you a couple of pictures, first off from my university here, and this is true of all the partner universities, I'm pretty sure. We have three pillars supporting the facade of higher education, the superstructure of higher education. They are research, teaching, and outreach. And we're supposed to be engaged in each one of those activities here at Stockholm University. That's part of our day job. So that's the ideal picture, that each one of these pillars supports the edifice of higher education. On the right here, I should probably check to see if there are any deans or perhaps my vice chancellor here close by, because this might not be popular, but this is my own perception of the reward structure or how we conceive and reward of these activities. And research is highly rewarded. When we look at promotions, when we look at tenure decisions, that sort of thing, we look primarily and firstly at how research is done. I'm happy to say that when I first joined Stockholm University, my perception of the teaching pillar, that it was even shorter. It's gotten much higher in the time that I've been here. So that's a positive development. But still, in my perceived notion of reward structures, it isn't as high as research. And my own perception is that outreach, the transdisciplinary aspect of what we do, is quite short. We don't reward that much, if at all, at least in the current structure. So how do we get to the ideal picture? Well, again, I'm looking forward to a conversation, but there is literature about this issue, this problem as well. This comes from one paper shown at the right about perhaps we need not a one bucket system where you simply toss all of the activities into a single bucket, research, teaching, and service or outreach. But we have three buckets, and you have to be above the line, you have to be above the bar in each one of the buckets in order to be properly rewarded. Implicitly, I find this kind of interesting, implicitly, if you look here, the research bucket is valued larger than the other two still, even in this new system. I think that's part of the conversation that we need to have. So, to try to sum up and go forward, where do we go from here? We have a number of questions that I'd like to leave this presentation with and continue the conversation, not only today, again, but throughout CIVIS, is these. What is a good balance in education between that depth of disciplinary knowledge and the knowledge we need to make connections between different wicked problems and deal with 21st century issues? How do we actually resolve that tension and come to a new balance there? What kinds of changes at our universities would better enable us to create educational and research programs that prepare our students for that interconnected, highly dynamic, many times controversial world that they have to deal with, that we have to deal with? That's implicitly and explicitly included in things like the Green New Deal, the European Green New Deal. And finally, of particular interest to here at Stockholm University, since we're hosting the first hub on climate, environment, and energy, what special challenges does that particular theme place on our educational system in terms of combining depth and breadth and transdisciplinarity in our educational systems? So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. Thank you for listening. And I look very much forward to continuing the journey together that we're taking with CIVIS and trying to come up with a system for higher education in the Anthropocene. Thank you very much.